Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. In the last 50 years or so, and even more perhaps in the last 30 years, admission to college has been a matter of overwhelming, even freakish concern to millions of American families and their children, to those who are fortunate enough to have possible choices. At the apex of this phenomenon is what can perhaps justifiably be called a neurotic concern on the part of those who can aspire to it over gaining admission to Ivy League, Little Ivy, and similar state schools, and most especially gaining admission to the big three of the Ivy League, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Today, in the first of two programs on it, we shall discuss a book on the subject of admission to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton for the last 105 years, from 1900 until today. The book is The Chosen by Jerome Karabel, who is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and a senior fellow at the Longview Institute, which he describes as a new progressive think tank. The Chosen tells a story that to a significant extent is a reflection of changes in this country since 1900, a time when the nation, like the Big Three, was ruled by a WASP establishment. With me to discuss the book is its author, Jerome Karabel, and I am Lawrence Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Jerry, thank you for coming to be with us today and on the next program. Berkeley is a long way away. I know it's a long and tiring trip. I'm glad that you were willing to make it because the book is an important book.
Thank you.
Why don't we start, Jerry, if you don't mind, by you telling the audience why the book is divided into three sections, roughly 1900 to the 1930s, roughly the 1930s to the 1960s, roughly the 1960s until today.
Well, the first period is a very decisive period in the history of these institutions because this is the period when they introduced quotas, limiting the number of Jews, and they also introduced non-academic criteria into the admissions process. And 1933 is an intentional breakpoint because that's when James Bryant Conant becomes president of Harvard. He's one of the great luminaries of American higher education in the 20th century. And he favored a somewhat more meritocratic policy, somewhat more emphasis on academic qualifications. He also introduced these national scholarships to permit people who were talented to attend regardless of family financial circumstances. And so there's a long period of gradual progress toward greater meritocracy in that second period. Then the third period I would describe as the period of inclusion, because this period of greater so-called meritocracy, in fact, excluded women altogether, de facto excluded most African Americans. And so this is the period from 1967 or so onward of greater inclusion.
Right. Now, every single thing that you mentioned, I think it's fair to say we will discuss extensively,
Yes.
excuse me, during the course of the 2 hours. However, early on in what you said, you pointed out that in the 1900s, early 1900s, the Big Three introduced methods of selecting students which were different from before.
Yes.
And they still use those methods to a considerable extent today, particularly
Yes.
the non-academic methods. You point out early on in the book, it's probably on the very first page actually, that schools elsewhere, great universities elsewhere in the world, in Tokyo, in Paris, at Oxford and at Cambridge, so on and so forth, do not use the same system used by American universities, including the Big Three, and would indeed laugh to scorn what our universities do. Why don't you tell what the universities abroad do and your opinion on whether they or their nations have been harmed by the fact that they do it differently than we do?
Well, I think the archetypal cases of countries doing it differently are France and Japan, both of which have exam-based systems. And for example, to get into Tokyo University, the leading university in Japan, you have to pass a very rigorous exam, and it's fairly straightforward. There are a certain number of places, and the people who score highest are admitted. The same in France, admission to écoles normales supérieures, école polytechnique, and so forth. So it's very straightforward. There's an objective test, and the people who score the highest are admitted. And so
it's a real neurosis-producing set of exams, isn't it?
Oh, yes. And in Japan, there's a lot of discussion of what they call exam hell, and there's a lot of pressure and so forth. It's not as if these systems don't have their downsides as well. But from their perspective, the idea that in America, whether someone could throw a ball or run with a ball would help you get into the leading universities in the nation.
Or be a legacy.
Or be the child of someone who happened to go there. They find this beyond bizarre. They just find it incomprehensible. So the system that we take for granted, and this is one of the things I emphasize in the book, is actually very strange when you detach yourself and look at things either from a comparative or a historical perspective. Now, as far as how these societies have been affected, well, obviously Japan and France are both pretty well-functioning societies. Their economies are fairly strong. Certainly France has greater social protection for the more vulnerable segments of its population. But I think
except perhaps the Muslim part, but that's
yes,
just finding out.
Yes, that's true, I think. In the case of France, I think some of the distinctive features of their intellectual life, the fact that a lot of their leaders have a philosophical grounding, these have to do with peculiarities of the educational system. I do remember when I was a graduate student for 1 year in France, I was quite stunned because here, when we have posters in dorm rooms, it might be of, rock stars or hip-hop stars or great athletes. They would have huge posters of people like Jean-Paul Sartre, right. And they would be decorating their dorm rooms. So it's a different kind of atmosphere that's not unrelated to the kind of system
I
they
have read that in France, intellectuals and public intellectuals in particular have a much higher standing than they do in America, and I think what you see in the dorm rooms perhaps reflects that. But in any event, why would they consider, what drives their entrance requirements that causes them to consider what we do, to use the word you used, bizarre?
Well, I think one thing to emphasize is that their leading institutions are state institutions rather than private institutions. So they tend to follow, more universalistic kind of bureaucratic procedure. They also are very centralized states. So the centralized state basically sets down certain rules as to how you advance in those societies. And these exams, I think, are part and parcel of that broader system.
And they therefore consider it, for some reason, bizarre that we don't rely simply on exams, which we don't.
Which we don't. I think they do consider our system very personalistic, highly subjective, and subject to prejudice and whim.
Which it is.
Which it is.
Yeah, yeah. Which is something we will discuss.
Yes.
Now, you wrote about Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But isn't it true that as Maine goes, so goes, what was it? As Maine goes, so goes the nation, became as Maine goes, so goes Nebraska?
So goes Vermont, I think.
But as Yale, Harvard, and Princeton went, so went the rest of the academic world in the United States. Why did you choose to write only about Harvard, Yale, and Princeton? And am I right in thinking that as they went, so went the rest of the academic world in this country?
Well, I chose Harvard, Yale, and Princeton because these are the three institutions that more than any others have been pathways to the American elite. That all the various studies of the educational origins of members of different sectors of the elite show that more of them were educated at these three institutions than anywhere else. Probably related to that is the fact that the clamor for admission to these institutions has been most intense, and hence the battles over the criteria have been extremely intense. Now, I would say in recent decades, Stanford has joined them as a kind of informal fourth member of the big three, the kind of West Coast version of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But the book also does discuss a number of other institutions. It discusses Columbia, it discusses Dartmouth, and there are also some references to the University of Chicago, which served as a kind of negative example, especially to Harvard, because Chicago had a more academic admissions policy.
Right. And similarly, with regard to the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia, which were often taken as negative examples of what Harvard, Yale, and Princeton did not wish to become.
Yes, and Columbia and University of Pennsylvania in particular failed to control their so-called Jewish problem, and that had repercussions that Harvard, Yale, and Princeton wished to avoid.
We'll discuss, and it's quite amazing to read that they very openly called things the Jewish problem.
Absolutely.
One cannot imagine today saying that something is the Asian American problem or the African American problem.
Yes.
Just like one is horrified as an aficionado of the Civil War, I think I understand why African Americans don't study the Civil War. When one reads the descriptions of them, the way they were described, you know, to say the Jewish problem is nothing at all.
Right.
But in any event, you said that these three schools, and now Stanford too, have long been regarded, have been regarded for over 100 years as pathways to the elite. Well, one might say pathways for the elite to remain elite. That would be another way to put it.
Yes.
Do you agree? By the way, some very famous and liberal officials, Kingman Brewster for one, who was the president of Yale, agreed with that. And the schools themselves have always agreed with that. Do you agree with that? There are people who do not agree that these four schools give one, or three schools in those days, give one a fantastic leg up in this world. What is your opinion about that?
Well, I do think, I don't know whether it's a fantastic leg up. I think they do give them a leg up. And there are a variety of ways in which they do this, but I would say one of the principal ones is what sociologists call social capital. That is to say, the networks or contacts that people make in these schools, which then can facilitate their advancement later in life. I think there's also a symbolic aspect to these schools. That is to say, the very fact that you have the degree has some symbolic meaning and confers some kinds of advantages. That said, I think one should be cautious because some of the advantages that the people have don't have to do with their having attended Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. They have advantages often of social class background. They may be very ambitious people, which is part of what brought them to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton in the first instance. They're at least reasonably good academically in recent decades. So these are people who would have done well and would have been disproportionately represented in the elite, regardless of where they went to school. That said, I do believe, and there's a wide body of research supporting this, that going to these schools does give them a definite leg up.
Let me put a question of cause and effect to you, Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
People like Kingman Brewster, perhaps one ought to say even Kingman Brewster, because he was a guy whose heart was largely in the right place, which was not always true of the leaders of those schools.
Mm-hmm.
Even Kingman Brewster believed, as those schools have propounded for 100 years.
Longer even.
Longer even, that's true. That they are selecting people who will be the elite of American society. In point of fact, if they are right in saying that going to these schools does give you a leg up of whatever degree, and sometimes I think a very high degree, that's my personal opinion based on my personal experience, then they've got cause and effect all wrong, don't they? It's not that they're selecting people who will be the elite of American society. It is to some major extent that people become the elite of American society because they go to those schools.
Well, I think you take Kingman Brewster as an example, and Kingman Brewster was, a liberal reformer. He was part of the progressive wing of the elite. He used to talk about Yale having a responsibility to educate 1,000 leaders. Not coincidentally, Yale used to admit about 1,000 freshmen when he was articulating this position. Now, in fact, many of the 1,000 people would not become leaders of any sort, however broadly defined. But the aspiration of Yale and these other institutions has been to educate as many leaders as possible. I think that these people are disproportionately represented in the elite. Most of the elite, however, did not attend these schools or schools like them, that America has a fairly complicated and diverse elite. But there is vast overrepresentation of people who have gone to schools such as Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And I think it is partly a function of birth. That is to say, George W. Bush, for example, would be a perfect example. He was someone who was probably destined to have a fairly high position by birth, and going to Yale was probably not the crucial factor in determining his position in life. It may have helped him in some particular ways. So I think they have a kind of complicated relationship where on the one hand, they transmit privileges of a segment of the existing elite, but they also have a mobility function where they handpick some people who are not from the elite, who may be destined for the elite.
Jerry, I want to talk about the somewhat contrary opinion of a fellow named Alan Kruger and
Yes.
his co-writer Stacy
Dale.
Dale
Yes.
Dale Berg.
Yes.
But before I do, I want to ask you your opinion of a subject that I've written about in a blog that I do, and I've never seen anybody else refer to it except a joke made by Alan Dershowitz on television one day. What do you think about the fact, in this particular regard, in the regards we've been talking about, that if Samuel Alito is confirmed, we will have on the United States Supreme Court 6 graduates of Harvard, 2 from Yale, and 1 from Northwestern, and 2 from Stanford will have just, that would be Rehnquist and
O'Connor.
excuse me, O'Connor will have just been on. But it'll be 6 from Harvard, 2 from Yale, 1 from Northwestern. The current president is from Yale. The last president was from Yale. The president before that was from Yale. John Kennedy was from Harvard. Roosevelt was from Harvard. I live on the East Coast. I have lived on the East Coast ever since I left the Michigan Law School. And it's my considered opinion that on the East Coast in law and throughout the academic world all over the country, one is at a significant disadvantage if one has not gone to one of these 3 schools. Now, that's a couple of questions wrapped into one.
Well, I think it depends on the segment. I can say that, for example, if you're trying to rise in the arena of law, all the evidence suggests that where you went to law school is extremely important, and certainly going to these institutions may facilitate entrance into some of the leading law schools. So we did our own study, which is not reported in the book, of the law faculty at the leading 6 and I think dozen law schools, and a remarkable proportion.
You held that out?
Yes, there are things actually in this long book that are not in the book, and a remarkable proportion of them did their undergraduate education at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And I think the legal profession is a perfect example where failure to go to certain schools virtually precludes getting partnership in certain kinds of firms and so forth. I think the business world is much...
Can I interject
yes,
something?
Yes.
And then you go back to the business
Sure.
world.
Yes.
You know, 175 years ago, roughly,
Yes.
de Tocqueville, when he toured America, said that the law profession is the aristocracy of America.
Yes.
And I think that has largely remained true for good or for ill, because vastly disproportionate portions of our governing class,
Yes.
and indeed even of Wall Street, are people who are lawyers. Now, what you are saying is that if de Tocqueville was and remains right, that 3 schools have had a dramatically disproportionate effect on what is the aristocratic class of this nation.
Well, I think that certainly in terms of the government, I think the figure was something like by 2008, for 48 of the last 108 years, the President of the United States will have been a graduate of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, undergraduate. So that doesn't even include people like Clinton and Gerald Ford, who went to Yale Law School. Of what's called the inner cabinet, that is the 4 most important positions, defense, state, attorney general, and treasury, a third of those went to just these 3 institutions. I think the legal profession, especially in its higher reaches, you know, the legal profession is a very stratified profession, but in its higher reaches, in academe, in the courts, in major partnerships at leading firms, there's a heavy concentration of people who went to these institutions and similar kinds of institutions. On the other hand, to return to my earlier point, in the business world, the proportion of people who are corporate executives who went to these schools is lower, and according to a recent article in the New York Times by David Leonhardt, actually is dropping a bit. So you have a kind of paradox where business, which is the preeminent institution in the United States, is not as quasi-monopolized or monopolized by people from these kinds of schools as certain segments of the public sector, some kinds of professions, perhaps certain segments of publishing and so forth.
Yeah.
So it varies depending on this segment of the elite.
Yeah. I'll just add one last point to that, which is something when we did we at our school did a count a number of years ago I think something like 52 or 57 of the members of the United States Senate were lawyers. So there's another example of how it reaches into the very highest levels.
No question. And by the way, in the recent Supreme Court case concerning the University of Michigan, lots of figures were presented as to the incredible importance of the legal profession in the larger society.
Yeah, which may not be such a great thing, but that's another story. As I said earlier, Alan Kruger and Stacey Dale Berg, or Berg-Dale, disagreed with some of the points you were making. What did they say, and what's your response to it?
Well, they did a very interesting study in that they took some high school seniors who applied to institutions, and they had data on whether or not they got in, and then they had data on where they went, and then they had some data on their subsequent career paths. And what they showed, which I think is largely correct, is that most of the difference between someone, let's say, who goes to Brown, let's say an Ivy League school, and Penn State, is explained not by the difference between Brown and Penn State, but by prior differences in social background, in aspirations, in academic performance, and so forth. So they make a very, I think, extreme argument that once you control for all of these things, that in fact there is no effect. But even in their own study, what they show is that people who are from minority or working class backgrounds do actually have a benefit from attending these schools. So if you're in that small group of people from relatively unprivileged backgrounds who go to these schools, then you do benefit. So that, in a way, I think, modified or attenuated the import of their finding. But I would also say that their study is one of many studies, and the bulk of the literature points in the other direction. But I do think on one crucial point, they're correct. To take an example from my own territory in California, if you compared people from Stanford and let's say Hayward State, which is a fine state college, you would find that the people from Stanford had much higher status occupations, they made much more money, and so forth. And so the question is, how much of that is due to these people having gone to Stanford versus Hayward State, and how much is due to other characteristics on which they differed at the point of college entry, the so-called selection effect. And I think there's a consensus among the scholars who study this that most of that difference is due to pre-existing differences. It's not a Stanford effect. But some proportion of it, I still do believe, and most of the people who do research in this area, is an independent Stanford effect.
I'm going to come back to that after the next question. So I want to get one question out of the way. What you have said in this book and what you were saying on this show is material of vast import. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface yet of what you're going to say. Is material of vast import to the question of social mobility in this country. Did you write this book to educate the public, to educate scholars, some combination of the two? And secondly, to what extent did your goal affect the nature of the book itself?
So it's a great question, and the answer is that I tried to do a very difficult thing, which is, on the one hand, I tried to satisfy my scholarly colleagues and meet the highest academic standards of research and logic and evidence. At the same time, I tried to write a book that would be of interest to the broader public. And so I tried to write it in a way that would be interesting to people. I did make a conscious decision to try to tell the book as a story. The book has characters, some of whom I think are quite colorful. Yeah. The book actually has pictures, and some of the pictures are, I think, very interesting. And the book does not have any tables or diagrams or charts. So these were all conscious decisions made to make the book, as it were, reader-friendly and to try to reach a broad audience. At the same time, the book has over 3,000 endnotes. Yeah. And so,
which are some of the most, which contains some of the most fascinating material in the book.
Yes, well, thank you. And I think for people who are interested in the topic, it is well worth reading the endnotes because they aren't just sources and citations, but they often have substantive material. So what I tried to do was to balance the needs of the scholarly world with the needs of the broader public. And I tried to write it in a way that would address both, and I guess it's for the reader and my fellow scholars to judge the extent to which I succeeded, but it did affect the way I wrote the book.
In this regard, Jerry, would you call yourself a child of the 50s? And the reason I ask the question is this. I grew up thinking that this was the appropriate methodology for a scholar, to bring information of great import before not just fellow scholars, but the public. And that's indeed why we do our television shows, and why we do a magazine that we do, but preeminently the television shows. And this all seems to have been lost dramatically in the last 40 years, and in a certain sense, what you've done is a throwback to an idea which, even if never really implemented, was a governing idea 50 years ago. What's your reaction to this question?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the 1950s. I was born in 1950, so I am a child of the 50s. I came of age more in the 60s. And I do remember as an undergraduate reading C. Wright Mills, great sociologist of the 1950s and early 1960s, authors of such work as The Power Elite, The Sociological Imagination, White Collar. And I remember having an almost reverential attitude toward Oxford University Press and this imprint Galaxy. And my first two books were with Oxford, partly because of the psychological effect of the association with C. Wright Mills. And C. Wright Mills was a great example of someone who was a great scholar, but who really tried to write for the public, and who succeeded in doing so. And already, even then, he was somewhat marginalized within the profession of sociology as too popular. Now, what I tried to do here with all the endnotes and the documentation was to write a book that did meet scholarly standards. But yes, this idea that you try to address the public as well as your colleagues, this is an idea that has become increasingly peripheral to academia as it's become more specialized.
Yeah. One of the great examples in a field that I'm very interested in, history, and particularly Civil War history, is James McPherson, who, as I understand it, has been marginalized by many professional historians because he has been so successful in bringing brilliantly written books on the Civil War to the public. And he's, of course, one of the leading scholars on the Civil War.
Well, I think the discipline of history compared to social science does a bit better in kind of crossing the divide between the scholarly world and the public. But I think the social sciences, economics, psychology, anthropology, political science, sociology, have been less successful than history in finding a way to communicate to the public, which ultimately, of course, sustains the scholarly world.
You know, there was a movie on Mozart a number of years ago, and the king of, I don't know, Prussia, whatever he was, heard something by Mozart, and he said to him, "Too many notes, Mozart, too many notes." And Mozart said, you know, "Well, which one would you remove, sire? But there's too much math, and there's too much jargon, and I'd remove it all." And I first formed that opinion in the 1950s when I was an economics major and started reading some of the, but anyway. We live in a world today, Jerry, we're in the big cities, New York, Washington, Chicago, LA. People are just nutso about the colleges. Why don't you tell a little bit, which you have done in the book, about what they do. It costs up to $30,000 for a consultant now, but what parents do, starting with kindergarten.
Yes, actually starting before kindergarten. It was quite shocking as I did the research. There are now people who are hiring special consultants to help their 2- and 3-year-olds prepare for the interview for preschool. So there are people who are actually doing this. And then there's certainly people who spend an extraordinary amount of energy trying to get their child into the right preschool, because it's felt that the right preschool leads to the right private elementary school, which leads to the right private secondary school, which then might lead to Harvard. Actually, the going rate, I'm now told, has gone up to $35,000 for private college counseling. So the system has gotten out of control. It has become a kind of obsession for a certain segment of the population, especially in some of the large cities that you mentioned. And what I say in the book about this is that the system has succeeded more in democratizing anxiety than in democratizing opportunity.
Right.
So now anxiety extends even into the highest reaches of the elite, because unlike 50 or 60 years ago, even the highest segments of the elite are not sure that they can get their children into these most prestigious schools.
Right, which, as we will talk about, is a result of certain changes in the admissions process. But before we wrap up this segment, they would like us to wrap it up, but I want to ask you a related question to what you were just talking about. It has long been my personal opinion, accepted by nobody outside of any room that I happen to be sitting in at the moment, that this is not only a serious national problem, but could be cured if the other schools and the big three and the major state schools and roughly 100 schools, give or take, in this country, if other schools would begin to focus extensively on providing, and this goes down to high school too, rigorous education, because that would enable their graduates and their students and their graduates to compete on an even basis with the graduates of these elite schools, and also people, I think, would ultimately come to see that this education is just as good as what you would get at Harvard. I think in the long run, even the contacts and networks would no longer mean as much as people began to realize that if you went to this school or that school or the other school, you're going to get a superior education. You know, in Mississippi, it helps to come from the University of Mississippi, which by national standards is not considered, you know, and the network is there, which is, you know, that won't get you anywhere in New York unless you're Willie Morris, and he's dead. What do you think about this idea? Is it a practicable idea, or will it founder because schools won't do it and parents won't believe that other schools can be just as good anyway?
I think it's very difficult to reform the existing system in any fundamental way. That America is a very unequal, ferociously competitive society. There are widespread anxieties about downward mobility, and for good reason, because in fact if you fall toward the bottom here, you have less protection, you're more vulnerable than in other societies. On the other side, if you are at the top, the rewards are greater than in any other country in the world. And we have a system, this odd mix of public and private institutions. The private institutions have some huge advantages because of their immense endowments. Harvard's endowment now is past $25 billion. So trying to find a way to produce greater equality in this system, given its structural and historic characteristics, it's very difficult, I think.
Yeah. We have to take a short break. We've only put our toe into the water here. We'll be right back. Stay with us for more on the admissions process at the Big Three.
Don't walk. Don't walk. Walk. Do not enter. Hot dogs. Definitely like hot dogs. Motorcycle club. Everything must go. Ghostly ghouls. Don't look at that, Teddy. Body piercing. Ouch.
Everyday moments can become teaching moments because learning starts long before school does. Give your child the start they need at bornlearning.org.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll put that out.
Two words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
Hey, yo, Ted, get on your job, kid. We got school, yo. I see you in the window, man. You want me to do? can, man. I got connections. We holding up traffic. Let's go. I'm not letting you waste your life like that, yeah.
Welcome back. Jerry, I take it from our discussions and from what you've read, although I frankly think you disguised it pretty well in the book itself. Maybe it just to some extent got lost because there was so much in the book, or maybe I just didn't read it closely enough. That you strongly disagree with the polarity, the economic polarity of American society, which doesn't make one a communist or a socialist, but simply one who thinks things have gotten out of hand. Although one might be a socialist, I don't know. Is that right? You strongly disagree, both as to the society generally and in the academic world? You disagree with the vast differentials that have been permitted to arise?
Yes, well, I do. You know, the book is primarily about the issue of inequality of educational opportunity in America, and especially inequality of opportunity in higher education. And so the book doesn't frontally address the issue of growing inequality per se, as opposed to inequality of opportunity. But the two are connected in that if you have yawning disparities in wealth and income between the top and bottom of the population, and then your governing ideology is that everyone has an equal chance to get ahead, it becomes very hard to put that ideology into practice. So you have these huge differentials depending on where people are born and where they end up in the educational system. And there is evidence of growing inequality of opportunity. So there's a study recently of the leading 100 or 150 universities and colleges in terms of selectivity.
146, actually, a very odd number.
Well, 146, yes.
A very odd number indeed.
And so it was quite remarkable in that I believe that the bottom quarter of the population contributed only 3% of the students. So the two are not unrelated. You can't, America's governing ideology is really one of equality of opportunity, that you're supposed to have an equal chance to get ahead regardless of the family you were born into, that accidents of birth should not determine your fate in life. But in reality, if you have a vastly unequal society and with the level of inequality growing, that ideology becomes more mythical than real. So I do think there's a problem. Now, I think more broadly, and this takes me a little bit beyond the book, that if you look at the United States comparatively, it's not simply that the level of inequality is greater here, but we have a higher proportion of the population in poverty. And there's a lot of research now, actually quite interesting research, on what's called SWB, subjective well-being. And it's very interesting in that it shows that for most of the population, increments in income don't really change their level of happiness or subjective well-being. But for poor people, it's very different, that getting poor people out of poverty makes a great deal of difference. And it makes a great deal of difference in their physical health. It makes a great deal of difference in their subjective well-being. And so I think we do have a problem here that there's not a great willingness to acknowledge. You know, there's this perception, and Ronald Reagan put it brilliantly from his political perspective, as he often did, that we fought against a war against poverty and poverty won. Yeah. Now, this is actually mythical, that in fact the Great Society actually reduced poverty to a very significant extent. But the legacy of that period is a widespread perception that poverty is intractable, that we can't do anything about it. And so when you look to bring this back to these institutions, as they're now trying to get a higher proportion of people from low or lower middle socioeconomic backgrounds, they're actually having difficulty because their standards are often incompatible with the actual educational opportunities that are available to people from the least advantaged segments of the society.
Jerry, is it true that, in your judgment, that it is mythical that America has a higher degree of social mobility than the other Western democracies?
Yeah, in fact, the latest research suggests, and this was a bit of a shock to me, because historically the research has suggested that America's mobility pattern is roughly the same as other countries. The perception that there's greater mobility.
Not higher?
Not higher, no. Historically, it's been about the same. Now, I'll qualify that in just a minute in a couple of ways. But in a recent study of 9 major countries, the United States and Britain actually were taking up the rear. We had the least social mobility, and interestingly, we had the greatest level of income inequality. And I think the two are at least loosely connected. I think the one difference between the United States and other countries is that there are more immensely wealthy people here. And that some of the immensely wealthy people, it is true, come from modest backgrounds. And some of the immensely wealthy people are in fact from immigrant backgrounds. And so the opportunity to get really, really wealthy is greater in the United States. And if you come from a modest background, even a foreign background, there probably is a greater opportunity to become immensely rich than in other countries.
What would you say about the following idea? That the fact that there have been some immigrants, some people
Yes.
from poor backgrounds who have become immensely wealthy. Let us start with Vanderbilt, for example,
Yes.
or Carnegie in the 19th century. This has misled people into thinking, well, it's sort of a social opiate, as it were. It's misled people into thinking that they too will have such a chance. Well, yes, they have such a chance. It's just that those who can make use of this chance are such an infinitesimally small figure that, to a real extent, we're fooling ourselves.
Well, I think there is an issue there. One of the figures that I cite in the book, which shocked me when I saw it, there were 2 aspects of distortion of reality. One was that 20% of the American population somehow thought they were in the top 1% of the income distribution. Well, obviously, only 1% by definition can be in the top 1%. But more interesting to me was that another 19% thought they would soon enough be in the top 1% of the income distribution, which in fact, given patterns of income mobility, is totally wrong. So people retain a kind of optimism about their chances to get ahead that in fact is not consistent with the realities of how the system works.
What do you think about the notion that, on the one hand, this has been a great psychological panacea, because in this country, unlike so many others, one might even say any others in the world, there was always hope. On the other hand, it's been a psychological disaster, because perhaps the reason people of middle income and above don't feel better when they make more money is there's always this person out there whose name is Bill Gates or the equivalent, who's got a lot more. And in America, we're all supposed to be able to get it, and so we all want it and think we have a right to it and think we have the talent for it. And in other words, bottom line, on the one hand, psychologically helpful because there's hope and optimism. On the other hand, psychologically disastrous because people are always, excuse me, jealous.
Well, I think there certainly is, a lot of jealousy and feelings of what we in sociology call relative deprivation. I think one of the features of the system here, and quite different at least from historically the systems in Europe, is if in Europe you didn't attain a high position, you could explain it quite readily as, well, you were born into a certain milieu and people of your background didn't get to high positions. That explanation or excuse is much less available in the United States, that the ideology says that you can succeed, it's up to you. The other side of that, the downside of it, is if you fail, then it's your fault. And so in that sense, I think it has caused a lot of pain. And I guess I also believe, and actually some of the leading administrators in the Big Three, including some of the liberal reformers, basically were very explicit in seeing social mobility as an alternative to demands for greater equality.
Right.
And so the two are connected in that sense, and that runs throughout the narrative of the book.
Right.
So the great reformers basically saw their institutions being more open, more inclusive, and providing more opportunities for mobility as an alternative to more radical movements demanding greater equality of condition.
I mean, the way you describe it is that we will let some of these people into our institutions so that they can rise on the social ladder. That will be a safety valve and will mean that there will be fewer demands for leveling across the board?
Yes, for radical change in the system. And even as recently as 2003 with the Grutter versus Bollinger case in the University of Michigan affirmative action case, Justice O'Connor was very explicit, speaking more about the racial issue as opposed to the class issue, where if it's not obvious that there are opportunities to get ahead and to rise in the legal profession for African Americans, then the entire legitimacy of the system might be called into question. So there is this safety valve or pressure release function of mobility. And I guess what I would emphasize both here and in the book is that there are really two issues. There's the issue of objectively how much mobility there is, and then there's the issue of the perception of mobility. And in some ways, the issue of perception is more consequential than the issue of objective reality.
We have this terrible phenomenon in America where the sizzle not steak, perception is reality, you know, and so on and so forth.
And there's a lot of concern about creating the right perception.
Right, instead of the right reality.
Yes, although to be fair to people like Brewster, he wanted to change the reality as a way of changing the perception.
Don't you think, well, what do you think about the following notion? The way that the American dream was presented, the way social mobility was presented in the 50s after the war, and maybe on even to our own day, was extremely misleading because it wasn't presented with the kinds of nuances that you've just presented it with. It was presented more in the sense that anybody can rise to the very top. And as the history of these schools shows, and we haven't even begun to talk about that yet.
Yes.
That's just baloney. That's just baloney.
Well, in point of fact, if you take a kind of sober, objective look at it, the family into which you were born has an enormous effect on your ultimate trajectory. And actually, in my own state of California, now moving to the public sector, we did a study of my own university, the University of California, and we looked at a single factor, which is the proportion of parents who have graduate degrees in the particular school district. And then we looked at the proportion of students from that school district who were accepted to any of the University of California campuses. And we were able to predict over 2/3 of that with this one variable. So just knowing the educational level of the community enabled us to say with remarkable precision the proportion of people who would be admitted to the University of California. So this problem goes well beyond Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But I would say one thing about the 1950s and 1960s. There was an element of reality in the following sense, that because the economy was expanding and because prosperity was broadly shared, in part because of strong labor unions, that people could be mobile, not necessarily vis-a-vis other segments of the population, but vis-a-vis their own parents and vis-a-vis their standard of living earlier in their lives. So there was a kind of escalator carrying the whole population upward. So in that sense, there was the mobility of rising prosperity. And really after 1973, that started to change. But there was this kind of golden era from World War II into the early 70s where people were at least rising materially and the prosperity was shared broadly throughout most of the population.
As a general matter, Jerry, one of the key points in your book, you describe it as a key point, is that the definition of merit, which is the definition by which one gains admission to the Big Three or any one of the others of these 146 schools, it might even be 180 schools, who knows. The definition of merit is a reflection of political and social power and not something which exists on its own out there in the ether, as it were, but it's politically and socially determined and has been at the Big Three since the beginning. Why don't you elaborate on that? Now, we're going to have to take a break here in a little while, but I'm going to tell them to hold off the break until you finish elaborating on that.
Okay. Well, the best way to, I think, explain this is to look at the old system in the early 20th century, where Harvard, Yale, and Princeton basically had an exam-based system. And if you passed the exam, you were admitted. If you failed, you were excluded. If you were in the gray zone, then they had a little bit of latitude. And when that system started to admit too many of the wrong people, the socially undesirables, as they were referred to then, primarily
Now, can
Jews.
I interject something here?
Yes.
You make the point, it gets lost a little bit, but you make the point that for the socially desirables, you could take that test over and over again.
Yes.
And that half the people did take it more than once, the people from the prep schools. And not only that, but if you'd never passed the test, you could be admitted with conditions.
Yes, there was latitude. So if you really failed, you were out, even if you were from a very elite background. But if you went to the right private school, chances you could pass the test at that time were pretty good. If you didn't pass it, you could take it again. Even if you passed some but not others, you could be admitted on so-called conditions. So there was a lot of latitude. You had to be pretty thick if you were from the elite not to be able to get in this period. But there were cases where you couldn't. But I think the other side of the system was equally important, which is if you came from the wrong background, but you could pass the exam, you would be admitted. It was as simple as that. And that's why that system was eliminated and why that definition of merit was changed. It was changed because it started to produce the wrong outcome. And so, very briefly, then the new system that was introduced a new definition of merit that emphasized such subjective things as character, leadership, personality, extracurricular activities, and the new definition of merit reflected the power of the existing largely Protestant elite to impose a definition that would serve its interest and would have the effect of excluding a greater number of, quote, undesirables.
Yeah. Now, we're going to take a break. And after we get done with that, we're going to come back and elaborate on how they implemented this system, what standards they considered the appropriate ones, and in other words, we're going to discuss the kind of discrimination that went on for about 60, 65 years. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It just rented.
My name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street.
It's not available.
I use a wheelchair and...
It's gone.
Hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim, call us.
A child from foster care. Just being there makes all the difference.
Go to jail for a gun crime, and your family serves a sentence with you.
Welcome back. Jerry, why don't you tell what happened around 1900, 1905, 1910? What was the definition of merit? Why, why were those particular definitions of merit the definitions of merit, and all the stuff that revolves around that?
Well, in 1900, 1905, in terms of the definition of merit used for admissions, basically it was exam-based. Often it required knowledge of Latin, sometimes possibly Greek as well. And so it tended to admit people from the right backgrounds because you had to have gone to a certain kind of school to pass, prep schools basically, to pass these exams.
Eastern prep schools.
Eastern prep schools by and large. However, what happened then over the course of the next couple of decades was the growth of American public secondary schools, some of them quite good. And so some of the large urban high schools in major, especially eastern and some Midwestern cities, started to prepare people for these examinations. And so then a different segment of the population started to pass these examinations. When that happened, then we had this epical confrontation around the so-called Jewish question, or Jewish problem. And in essence, what this was that the proportion of Jews was rising, especially at Harvard and Yale, above all at Harvard. And by the early 1920s, it had reached 20%. And there was the fear, not unjustified, that if Harvard went the way of Columbia, that is to say, if the number of Jews, the proportion of Jews rose still higher, that the children of the Protestant upper class would decamp. They would leave the institution. They would find it an unpleasant environment.
Wasp flight.
Wasp flight is what I call it in the book, which is obviously a play on the notion of white flight. And so this was not imaginary. It was real. And so Harvard in 1922, explicitly under the leadership of Abbott Lawrence Lowell, who was someone who was also a vice president of the Immigration Restriction League, and this change in admissions.
Bigot, in plain words.
I think he was, it's fair to say, a bigot, a racial bigot, and certainly a religious bigot. Proposed explicitly and publicly that a quota of 15% be imposed on Jews. Now, in fact, there was widespread support within segments of the Harvard faculty, but a lot of people didn't want to be on public record as supporting a quota because in a very profound sense, a quota is un-American. It contradicts the idea that your advancement is based on your individual accomplishment rather than the group that you happen to be born into. So, in fact, this confrontation at Harvard really lasted 4 years, from 1922 to 26. And initially, the faculty actually voted down even a softened version of the proposal. But Lowell was undeterred. He felt that Harvard's fate was at stake. And so telescoping here, but it's covered in great detail in the book, is that Harvard and also Yale and Princeton came up with a dramatically new definition of merit. And the new definition of merit downplayed academic qualifications, played up personal characteristics, introduced interviews, introduced photos, introduced a questionnaire asking you about the maiden name of your mother, whether the family name had ever been changed, and if so, when and how. Lots of things designed.
And your mother's religion.
Your mother's religion, your father's religion, lots of things designed to identify the students of Jewish origin and to limit their numbers. But there was a broader change, and that is that a new definition of merit arose that was highly subjective, highly personalistic, and basically gave enormous weight to non-academic characteristics.
And they would use interviews by administrators and alumni.
Administrators and
I was
alumni.
once interviewed by a Princeton alumnus, you know.
Yes,
it's a whole other story.
And they would use this as screening, and I think they were very well aware that the interview would enable them to come up with an assessment of dress, of speech, of deportment, of appearance, and so forth, that they would be admitting someone on a whole variety of characteristics.
The book is The Chosen by Jerome Karabel, who is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and a senior fellow at the Longview Institute, which he describes as a new progressive think tank. The Chosen tells a story that to a significant extent is a reflection of changes in this country since 1900, a time when the nation, like the Big Three, was ruled by a WASP establishment. With me to discuss the book is its author, Jerome Karabel, and I am Lawrence Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Jerry, thank you for coming to be with us today and on the next program. Berkeley is a long way away. I know it's a long and tiring trip. I'm glad that you were willing to make it because the book is an important book.
Thank you.
Why don't we start, Jerry, if you don't mind, by you telling the audience why the book is divided into 3 sections, roughly 1900 to the 1930s, roughly the 1930s to the 1960s, roughly the 1960s until today.
Well, the first period is a very decisive period in the history of these institutions because this is the period when they introduced quotas, limiting the number of Jews, and they also introduced non-academic criteria into the admission objective test, and the people who score the highest are admitted. And So
it's a real neurosis-producing set of exams, isn't it?
Oh, yes, and in Japan there's a lot of discussion of what they call exam hell, and there's a lot of pressure and so forth. It's not as if these systems don't have their downsides as well. But from their perspective, the idea that in America, whether someone could throw a ball or run with a ball would help you get into the leading universities in the nation.
Or be a legacy.
Or be the child of someone who happened to go there. They find this beyond bizarre. They just find it incomprehensible. So the system that we take for granted, and this is one of the things I emphasize in the book, is actually very strange when you detach yourself and look at things either from a comparative or a historical perspective. Now, as far as how these societies have been affected, well, obviously Japan and France are both pretty well-functioning societies. Their economies are fairly strong. Certainly France has greater social protection for the more vulnerable segments of its population. But I think
except perhaps the Muslim part, but that's
yes,
just finding out.
Yes, that's true. I think that
of selecting students, which were different from before.
Yes.
And they still use those methods to a considerable extent today, particularly
Yes.
the non-academic methods. You point out early on in the book, it's probably on the very first page actually, that schools elsewhere, great universities elsewhere in the world, in Tokyo, in Paris, at Oxford and at Cambridge, so on and so forth, do not use the same system used by American universities, including the big three, and would indeed laugh to scorn what our universities do. Why don't you tell what the universities abroad do, and your opinion on whether they or their nations have been harmed by the fact that they do it differently than we do?
Well, I think the archetypal cases of countries doing it differently are France and Japan, both of which have exam-based systems. And for example, to get into Tokyo University, the leading university in Japan, you have to pass a very rigorous exam, and it's fairly straightforward. There are a certain number of places, and the people who score highest are admitted. The same in France, admission to écoles normales supérieures, école polytechnique, and so forth. So it's very straightforward. There's an
Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. In the last 50 years or so, and even more perhaps in the last 30 years, admission to college has been a matter of overwhelming, even freakish concern to millions of American families and their children, to those who are fortunate enough to have possible choices. At the apex of this phenomenon is what can perhaps justifiably be called a neurotic concern on the part of those who can aspire to it over gaining admission to Ivy League, Little Ivy, and similar state schools, and most especially gaining admission to the big three of the Ivy League, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Today, in the first of two programs on it, we shall discuss a book on the subject of admission to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton for the last 105 years, from 1900 until today. The book's
process. And 1933 is an intentional breakpoint because that's when James Bryant Conant becomes president of Harvard. He's one of the great luminaries of American higher education in the 20th century. And he favored a somewhat more meritocratic policy, somewhat more emphasis on academic qualifications. He also introduced these national scholarships to permit people who were talented to attend regardless of family financial circumstances. And so there's a long period of gradual progress toward greater meritocracy in that second period. Then the third period I would describe as the period of inclusion, because this period of greater so-called meritocracy in fact excluded women altogether, de facto excluded most African Americans. And so this is the period from 1967 or so onward of greater inclusion.
Right. Now, every single thing that you mentioned, I think it's fair to say we will discuss extensively.
Yes.
Excuse me, during the course of the 2 hours. However, early on in what you said, you pointed out that in the 1900s, early 1900s, the big three introduced methods